Everyone will start at 1:05, and I'll just go through the formalities. We'll then have, I think we have three advocates to speak on a panel, and then we'll go to the administration, and then we'll just continue to go through the language after that. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm City Councilor Lydia Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Operations. It's Tuesday, April 6th. We're here today for a virtual working session on Docket 0396, an ordinance amending City of Boston Code Ordinance, Chapter 6, Section 610, Language and Communications Access for City Services. This matter was sponsored by Councilor Julia Mejia and was referred to the committee on March 3rd. The matter is refiled from last year, and the committee held a hearing on this, an extensive hearing on October 27, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 executive order, we're modifying open meeting requirements and having this hearing on Zoom. This allows us to do our job, but also balancing the public safety needs of the moment. In short, we will be able to, the public may watch this working session via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv and on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 964. Will also be rebroadcasted at a later date. Written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made a part of the record and available to all councilors. Quick summary of the proposal. The proposal would amend the current Language and Communications Ordinance, Chapter 6, Section 610, by expanding upon the original objectives of the ordinance and making city programs, benefits, and services more accessible by offering translation or interpretation services for residents who may have a disability, are English language learners, or limited English speakers. The City Council and Mayor Walsh approved the current ordinance in 2016. Councillor Wu and former Councillor Tim McCarthy actually sponsored the original Language Access Ordinance in that year that ultimately became the law. As previously stated, this proposal would expand upon that law that we currently have by codifying an Office of Language and Communications Access, creating and codifying this office, hereinafter known as the office, which would be under the charge of a director. The office will serve as a main contact for language and communications access services and plans with city departments. The proposal would also require the office work with community to develop guidelines that reflect culturally competent interpretation and translation in order to provide a list of standards when contracting for interpretation and translation services. The proposal amends the definition section by adding new terms such as plain language, cultural competence, adult illiteracy, alternative communication, and universal design for learning in order to provide increased accessibility to maximize participation. The proposal would require signage about interpretation services, including using symbols to accommodate those that cannot read. The proposal strengthens data and reporting requirements of translation requests through the establishment of a centralized online dashboard that will publish usage and data requests and through requiring departments to share data with the office. The proposal also changes the translation section to require that vital documents be translated into languages spoken by 5% of the population or of the city of Boston or by 1,000 persons, whichever is lesser, which I think would be 1,000 people, otherwise known as the most commonly used languages. This is a change from the current ordinance, which imposes this requirement on city departments that receive federal assistance. The current ordinance requires that vital documents be translated into Spanish, Haitian Creole, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cape Verdean. At last year's hearing, the committee discussed the training and quality assurance of interpretation and translation services and how the city creates data to determine what language access services are needed. The administration explained that the city uses a plain language guide and uses the standard from an 8th grade reading level so that terms are understandable. The city uses census data and works with community organizations to determine the need for translation and access services. Joining me today are my colleagues, Councilor Ed Flynn and the lead sponsor, Councilor Mejia. Have I missed any city councilors who have joined between my introduction? Okay. Also joining us are advocate Yvonne Espinosa from the Lawyers for Civil Rights, Bethany Lee from the Asian Outreach Unit of Greater Boston Legal Services, and Carolyn Chow, who's director at Asian American Resource Workshop. We also have been joined by the administration, including Jennifer Vivar Wong, Director of Office of Language and Communications Access, Dominique Williams, Deputy Director of Equity and Inclusion, Cabinet, Natasha White, Chief of Staff, Equity and Inclusion, Cabinet, and Kristen McCosh, Commissioner of the Disabilities Commission, and Ann Lee, of the Senior Policy Advisor of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement. So I'm going to turn this over to the lead sponsor, Councilor Mejia, for any brief remarks. Councilor Asabi George has also joined us, and I will then go to Councilor Flynn and Councilor Asabi George for any opening brief remarks before we get to the advocate panel. Councilor Mejia.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Edwards, for working with our office to get us this working session up and going. I also want to just give a quick shout out to Councilor Flynn for his steadfast advocacy on all things that deal with language access, and to my previous colleagues who set the stage for us in 2016. Today is an incredible, exciting day because we have a chance to work collaboratively to create new systems of accountability to ensure that everybody in our city has a voice that can be heard. So much of the inequity in our city exists because we can't understand one another. The goal of this ordinance is to not see people as obstacles to the work, but as people who play a critical role in all decision-making in our city. I'd like to spend a little bit of time going over some of the important changes our ordinance makes, given that it's been over 6 months since our last hearing. First, this ordinance formally establishes the Office of Language and Communication Access and gives that office the ability to work with departments and the community to establish fair and equitable guidelines for interpretation and translation for every department. We expanded the number of languages in the city the city must provide services for, and we're requiring that any information released in multiple languages must be released at the same time as English. And we already know, and we've seen what happened during our COVID relief efforts and the trickling down impact that it had on our most vulnerable populations. We're requiring that all community meeting notices include a link to language access resources so that everyone can participate from the very beginning. We are requiring that all translation and interpretation reflect culturally competent and plain language so that when we speak, we are speaking in a way that we can actually understand. And while I appreciate the whole idea of 8th grade language, I think that we need to push ourselves a little bit further in terms of understanding and capacity. Finally, we're also laying the groundwork for the city to provide better services for people who cannot read or write in any language by utilizing text-to-speech technology. We're incredibly lucky to be able to work on this ordinance with some of our community activists and advocates who are in attendance today. Thank you to Carolyn Chow, Bethany Lee, Lisette Lee, Karen Chen, Dr. Nina Estrella Luna, Goribel Monta, Ivan Espinosa, and everyone else who played a role in getting us to where we are today. We also had the opportunity to work alongside the administration. So thank you so very much for all of the working pre-sessions that we did beforehand. And with folks like Jennifer Wong and Dr. Crockett, we really do appreciate the thought leadership that you brought to the table. We look forward to this working session and to seeing this ordinance move to the next level. Thank you.
Councilor Flynn and Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards and Councilor Edwards, for your important work on language and communication access and support of our immigrant community as well. In addition, thank you, Councilor Mejia, the important work that you're doing. I want to say thank you to the administration staff that is here and the advocates that are here. Everyone's working together, making sure that the voices of our immigrant neighbors or non-English speakers are heard in our city, including persons with disabilities. I see my friend Commissioner McCosh is on, and thank you for the tremendous work you do on assisting persons with disabilities. I don't think there's a more important issue in the city of Boston than language and communication access. If you're a resident of Boston and you don't speak English and you're unable to communicate effectively with city government, your voice is not heard. So I wanted to highlight the important role the city administration is playing, along with Councilor Mejia, Councilor Edwards, and the advocates. I know many from the legal community, the civil rights community. I know Chinese Progressive Association has been a leader in this front, but it's about working together, acknowledging that we have challenges, but working together to deal with them as a city and make changes that benefit the residents. Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you. Before we go to Councilor Sabi-George, I just wanted to note, and I apologize, Councilor Sabi-George, Councilor Bach actually sent me a note. If I can read that into the record very quickly. Dear Councilor Edwards, I'm unable to attend today's hearing on language access. I will review the hearing, and I will have a member of my staff on watching as well. My apologies. Thank you, Councilor Bach. So, Councilor Sabi-George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the maker for this hearing order and this continued work and commitment to this work. I look forward to today's hearing and testimony and the efforts and the suggestions and the guidance from both the administration and the advocates. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. With that, we're going to turn it over to the advocates. I think if Yvonne is ready, and if Yvonne is not ready, then we can turn it over to, I think it was... Oh, Yvonne is ready. Hi, Yvonne.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I am happy to proceed as it may please the Council.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to also thank Councillor Mejia, Councillor Flynn, and Councillor Sabi-George for joining us today for this important discussion. I am particularly grateful about being invited to testify this afternoon on language access, which is something near and dear to my heart and to our work. My name is Ivan Espinosa Madrigal. I am the Executive Director of Lawyers for Civil Rights. This afternoon, what I would like to do is express my strongest personal and organizational support for the establishment of an Office of Language and Communications Access. This is critical for the City of Boston so that we can coordinate language access across city departments and agencies. This will meet an absolutely dire need out in the community. Just about a year ago, a little bit more, Lawyers for Civil Rights presented a Title VI Civil Rights Language Access complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, in connection with Suffolk's Downs against the BPDA, one of the city's largest agencies and one that frequently interfaces with the community. In the Title VI complaint that we presented, we provided strong evidence that Arabic and Spanish speakers who are strong residents, well represented in the East Boston community affected by Suffolk Downs and other development projects, were systematically excluded from meetings and other engagements that the BPDA was making arrangements for, because it simply failed to provide interpreters and translators at meetings, and also failed to translate altogether, or sometimes with significant delay and incompleteness, vital documents that were really essential for the community to assess the scope of what was happening at Suffolk Downs. So we presented this in a Title VI complaint to HUD, which HUD took very seriously and expeditiously investigating, convening and conducting community-based meetings with many of the Arabic and Spanish speakers who had been excluded from the BPDA meetings. These community members told HUD directly about their deep frustration with their exclusion. They were eager to talk to the BPDA about gentrification. They were eager to talk to the BPDA and the city of Boston about housing displacement. They were eager to talk about climate change and resiliency strategies and suggestions. But none of this happened because there were no translators or interpreters, and because many of the materials surrounding Suffolk Downs were not translated into either Arabic or Spanish. This matter ended up settling quite favorably and successfully, with the city entering into a compliance agreement with HUD. This compliance agreement is state of the art. And I want to just highlight 3 pieces that are highly relevant for the Office of Language and Communications Access. One is the BPDA had to come up with a language access plan based on a population assessment. Number 2, the BPDA had to hire a language coordinator to help make sure that these problems don't happen again, that all relevant materials get translated and posted online, that interpreters and translators are available for meetings. And number 3, that the BPDA engage in affirmative community outreach and engagement so that communities that are diverse can be brought into the process. And so these 3 activities, the language access plan, the language coordinator, and community outreach and engagement, are hallmarks of success, all of which fall perfectly into the spirit of what we're talking about here today, which is the Office of Language and Communications Access. It shouldn't just be the BPDA that has these strong protocols. It should be a centralized agency that does this for all city departments across all city agencies. And so today, I want to strongly support the establishment of this office so that we can take these best practices and not just to implement them, but to bring them to scale across the city. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Madam Chair, and to this honorable body.
Thank you very much. Up next is Bethany Lee from Greater Boston Legal Services. Bethany?
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today. I just wanted to first thank you for focusing on language access in this meaningful way. It's incredibly important, I think, especially exacerbated, as we've seen exacerbated by the pandemic for all low-income communities of color, and certainly for people who are limited English proficient. We, in the Asian Outreach Unit at Greater Boston Legal Services, serve in particular low-income Asian American and immigrant families. And so we interact primarily with people who speak Vietnamese, Cantonese, and Mandarin in the Greater Boston area. And so I want to share a little bit about our experience during COVID-19 with respect to language access and making sure that needs are met, because I think it's instructive for how all agencies could be interacting with limited English proficient populations, particularly those in the Asian language speaking communities. Normally, in non-pandemic times, we do community-based clinics in Dorchester, in Chinatown, Malden, and other areas. And what we found during the pandemic is that we've actually been able to increase our community's access to our services by providing language-specific phone lines that have, and honestly, surprisingly, led to an increase in access. I think beforehand we had talked a lot about how phone lines sometimes aren't able to provide the type of access that our communities need, given the many different languages that our communities speak. But what we found that is in establishing a phone line where people in the community know that when they leave a message, they get called, and they know they leave a message in Vietnamese, Cantonese, and Mandarin, and they know that they're going to get called back in those languages. people consistently call us. And so we would encourage, in looking at the language ordinance, to think more deeply about what that means for 311. It's often the case that when people, even if people know that there's an interpreter that's available, they still aren't going to call because there's this extra barrier that is there in thinking about language. And so what we found that is, in terms of phone lines, what works is, even if people just leave a voicemail in their language, expecting that there will be a call back in that language, that has actually drastically helped to increase access to the services that low-income, limited English proficient populations need. It's also, given the hearing that we had last week, addressing anti-Asian violence in the city really is a way to make sure that Asians aren't invisible in the city of Boston. The ability to be able to access services directly in the language that you need is really critical in making sure that Asian Americans are heard in the city of Boston. And so what we're suggesting is not necessarily, we're not saying that every single department needs to have, every single language available individually, but that initial interaction is critical in making sure that people get over the hump of access, and then the ability to use interpreters, and make it more of a seamless system so that people are able to access city services is important. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then we have Carolyn Chow.
Thank you, Chairwoman Edwards, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm Carolyn Chu. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Resource Workshop and a steering committee member for the API's CAN Coalition, which is our statewide Asian American Civic Action Network. Want to thank Councilor Mejia and her staff for really getting in the weeds with me and Bethany, Lisette, and Karen around this ordinance. I think it's super important and super timely for us in the Asian community. When we think about anti-Asian violence, when we think about racism and white supremacy more generally, language access is a key part of how our communities can really be thriving and stable in the city, right, and have access. So I think this is really timely in this moment, as Bethany said, in the equitable recovery moment, and just we know it's time to continue to improve this work at the city. Just to emphasize some of what was shared already, I think the 311 piece is critical, especially when we think about crisis response, as well as just accessing city services. For all of us, right, we are always trying to figure out where the best entry point is, even with our own city needs and issues. And so I think having, as Bethany said, easily accessible ways for folks to get responses in the correct language and to know where to direct any sort of question is really important. I also did want to highlight, I think, as Yvonne kind of mentioned, that this is really about city departments, but I do think we all know that BPS and BPDA are places where there is a lot of need for language access and a lot of interaction with our communities. And so while I think this is such an important first step, I do want us to continue to think about how we can kind of streamline also with BPS and BPDA, where so many families and working class communities are interacting with the city government, though I know a little complicated on your end. Just to emphasize 311 and clear entry points so that folks can get access. And then also I think this conversation around plain language has been really important as we've been moving this ordinance forward, and that I think across the board, that's so going to be so important for us to really be creating content that is accessible to all of us, right? Even just thinking about how folks are trying to translate comorbidities, right, for a vaccine as just one very small example. We know that even for us, these things can be confusing. And so how we can streamline plain language so that people can really have their voice heard, interact with the different systems within the city, and have their voice heard is so critical, both in English and across all of these languages. So I think this is a really important step in this moment, and I'm really excited. I really hope we can figure out how to put, whether it's 311 and or if there's another way you all are thinking about doing it, but put in some more clarity on kind of those entry points and ways to make sure folks, even if they can't get on a website, are able to get access to city services in language. And I think the work that Bethany's staff has been doing, on the community side, we can say has been really effective, and has really helped us all organize and work with our communities better, including, as an example, right, when they're getting calls in on the GBLS hotline with Vietnamese tenants, then we're able to come in and do some more ongoing tenant organizing with those same residents after they've gotten their initial kind of contact and services met through Bethany's staff. So yeah, thank you so much for having us today, and looking forward to continue to work on this.
And thank you. And my apologies for mispronouncing your last name. So we're going to turn it now over to the administration. And I'm not sure if every person listed who's participating is going to be speaking. I see you smiling, Dominique. I'm not sure if everyone is going to be speaking, but I will just go ahead and turn it over to, I think, Jennifer Beaver Wong. And maybe, Jennifer, you can indicate amongst your colleagues who will be speaking or on. I'm not sure how you'd like to do this.
Thank you, Councilor Edward. I believe I will be the only one speaking.
Okay.
But thank you so much for the opportunity to allow us to come together and work on this ordinance today. As you all know, our main priority is to increase and create meaningful access within the city for persons who speak a language other than English and persons with a disability. And we do this by, working in partnership with departments to ensure that program services and information is accessible, as well as providing funding for accommodations and working with community organizations to inform them of the LCA services available within the city. That being said, thank you as well to all the advocates who are on here and for your testimony. There are some areas that we would like to discuss further today around in the ordinance around adult literacy, text-to-speech, audio recordings, vital document translations, the timeline of translations, and reporting. And we're very excited to get to work and want to defer back to you all as to whether it would be best to just dive right into the language.
If you would just go through that list of things you just said are things that you guys wanted to work on or discuss further. It was adult literacy, and then I couldn't write fast enough.
Sorry about no worries. Text-to-speech, audio recordings, vital document translations, the timeline of translations, and reporting.
And recording, you said?
Reporting.
Reporting.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. I think that's what we can probably do if you wanted to go in that order. To my colleagues, since we're working, right, it might make sense to just go ahead and go based off those buckets. But if you wanted to add any questions that we could also work through, that might also make sense as well. Councilor Mejia, did you have any questions? I don't know, that we could add to this bucket for discussion?
No, my questions are specifically for the advocates. I do want to spend a little bit of time really looking at some of the issues around adult literacy. Those things are important. And I think that there was a back and forth with us and the administration in terms of the ability and capability of achieving that task. So I'd love to be able to utilize this working session to figure out how we can, get to a good place in being able to address some of these things. I think those things are all important to us in this process. So looking forward to diving into it.
Great. And to the advocates, as we hit each bucket, we encourage you to raise your hand so that you can either emphasize, as Councillor Mejia had indicated she'd like to hear more from you about specific topics, just raise your hand. Councillor Flynn, were there any questions you wanted to add to the bucket? Councillor, did I miss that?
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. I was thinking about what the advocates were saying in the administration. You know, depending on what the population is of a particular group that speaks a certain language, say Vietnamese or Cantonese or Spanish, according to the demographics of the BPDA, factoring how many residents speak a particular language, I often wondered, does it make sense based on that number, based on that percentage, to almost have a percentage of city employees that also speak that particular language? You know, if you call up Boston City Hall now in various departments, I'm wondering how many Cantonese speaking city employees there are. I'm wondering how many Mandarin speaking employees there are, or Vietnamese speaking, or Spanish. And the reason I say it is if you don't get someone on the line that speaks your language, you would get frustrated and you would probably not call back again, unfortunately. But I'm just wondering if we are able to think about either long-term or short-term targeting city, upcoming new hires to do more recruiting of people that speak various languages so that the immigrant voice is heard in City Hall. Just wanted to throw that out there, Councillor Edwards.
You were thinking that in terms of hiring practices generally, or part of this ordinance requirement?
Yeah, I think hiring practices generally, okay. And if it had an impact on this ordinance, but factoring in that the population is ever changing, and do we have enough Spanish-speaking employees in city government? Do we have enough Cantonese-speaking employees? That's what I'd like to know. Certainly, we've seen the challenges we've had at the BPDA recently, with the Boston Public School System recently. Those are two of our biggest city departments or agencies. So just wanted to throw that out there. Maybe those comments might be helpful.
Thank you. Is the Councillor Asabi George, any questions?
I don't have any questions to add to the buckets. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the questions I would add to the bucket is the actual number. And this of folks, I know the ordinance has 5% of the population or 1,000 people as a cutoff for who would be included, the language. And I think, what are we, 600,000? So 10% is 60,000. So after that is about 30,000 people is 5% or 1,000. So I think we're basically saying, and it says whichever is less. So based on my basic math, 30,000 is more than 1,000. So I only say that because I wanted to know, we may not know today, if we use 1,000 people as a speaking language threshold, how many new languages would be added? I think it's worth noting, or at least asking. It could be, I have no idea. I don't expect the city to have that number, but I do think in a different conversation or next working session or something that if I don't know who to ask that to, you're on my screen, sorry. So I'm looking at you. So is Dominique technically. So I think it would be great for us to know if that's the threshold, how many languages we might be including. And that's all. So that's what I'm at the bucket list. So going back to the bucket, if we could start with the first bucket that you had, Jennifer, the adult illiteracy.
Yeah, of course. In Councillor Edwards, I can give you that number if you would like.
I'd love it.
So it differs when it comes to the neighborhood breakdowns, but when it comes to vital documents and citywide outreach, it would be 10 languages. And I can list them for you if you would like.
10 languages if you used 1,000 as threshold.
1,000 or 5%.
Well, the
Yes.
stamp 1,000.
That whole thing together, yeah. Yeah, 1,000. Yeah. So that would be what we would follow, the 10 languages.
10 languages. Okay, great. Thank you.
And then for neighborhood, as you all saw, the demographic data report would be broken down differently by the threshold within each neighborhood. So that would be different depending on the neighborhood.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So going to the first bucket, and then again to advocates, please raise your hands if you have something to add to this, or if there's something we're not emphasizing, or if you have a counter thought or suggestion, please just raise your hand. But to adult illiteracy, the administration can just speak to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. And so we do appreciate, we definitely see the importance of addressing adult literacy. One thing that we had brought up in our previous conversations was making adult literacy a center of its own ordinance, and allowing a space for experts who are already doing work within the city or within our communities and nonprofits, that space to be able to dictate kind of what they think will be beneficial. A lot of this work around adult literacy is being done within the Office of Workforce Development. So I definitely think like including folks from that office or in partnership. There's a lot of other organizations that partner with the city to provide programs for adult literacy for both English speakers and non-English speakers. So including those folks in those conversations, I think would also be incredibly great. And that's kind of where we're going and what we're envisioning when it comes to addressing adult literacy as a whole for the entire city.
So you find, I guess I want to make sure I understand your suggestion. You don't find that it comes under this ordinance, but it comes under workforce development?
I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it should be addressed in its own separate ordinance and getting more folks who are the experts within the city doing the work and other nonprofits that are partnering with the city to be able to provide that input into how that ordinance is shaped.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, I see you, Councilor Mejia. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that for me, when I think of the Office of Language and Communication Access, I see the ability to communicate with people in multiple ways as part of that bucket. I don't see it living in a separate place. And I do appreciate the whole idea of expanding the subject of adult literacy into its own conversation. But I think I still want to, I think it belongs here. And basically, if we were to do a separate ordinance, it will still likely be amending the ordinance that we're amending right now. So we're trying to lay down the groundwork here. And I think we could leave it more open, perhaps with the possibility of requiring the council to work within the given time frame. We do plan on bringing in some more advocates during the next working session to help elevate this conversation, but I still do think that when I think about language and communication access, I think being able to read and write and understand what is being communicated is definitely something that fits within the scope of work, which is, we knew walking in that this was going to be a point of difference, but I do believe that in the spirit of engaging people and being able to communicate with them, that this belongs here. So we just have to figure out how we can make it fit.
Any other thoughts on the adult literacy?
I think we had talked a little bit about this in pre-meetings, and I know there's a couple of questions that were outstanding. I just wanted to recognize Commissioner McCosh and see if there was any input that she had to give on this issue. You're on mute. There you go.
Hi, sorry about that, Counselor. Thank you for looping me into this conversation. I was involved very closely at the beginning of the work on the language ordinance way back several years ago, and I really appreciate that accessibility and language communication was looped into the office. That being said, I do a lot of that work in my own office, and I've coordinated closely with Manar before Jennifer, and now work very closely with Jennifer. Language access for disabilities is, as we know, has been very top of mind lately, is American Sign Language. And there are other accommodations that need to be made for people who are blind and have other maybe speech communication, things like that. The issue of adult literacy, I have not been involved in. I will say that. And I know that even working with Jennifer's shop with limited resources and things like that, we have been trying to push effective communication more as training from Jennifer's shop, and then working with other departments to ensure that they can do it on their own. So I don't know that I have a lot to contribute to the issue of adult literacy, but I'm happy to talk more on issues of language access, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to bridge is how or whether adult literacy and language access are in the same buckets. I don't think anyone disagrees that we need both, more of both. Okay, so this is not a question of one or not. It's here or other. And the only reason why I also bring it up is the I believe in the ordinance, the place where adult literacy is mentioned is really in the text to speech component. So not so much. It seems actually when I've seen text to speech, it's been mostly for people who are blind or are vision impaired in some way, shape, or form. So I'm go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, that is the main use of it for disability access, people who are blind or have visual impairment. That being said, most of the people I work with in that community have devices that do that automatically, like iPhones and things like that. So I wasn't involved in any conversations about how the city would implement that as an accommodation. And I don't know, I don't recall that language in the ordinance exactly.
It's just with regards to the adult literacy, or trying to acknowledge that those who can't read or write, illiteracy, excuse me, you can have all the languages in the world written down. It will be useless to them. And that there might be other ways to communicate basic things, stop here, red sign, go, green arrow, that in general, I think is trying to help acknowledge that people are on different journeys in accessing their own language. Writing, reading, did I get it right, Councilor Mejia? So on the adult literacy component, then what I hear is there's a question of how does it marry within maybe within language access, or if it is, do you think it's calling on us to do too much? I'm asking the administration.
I think what we would love to see is also perhaps if you have maybe getting some research together, focus groups together to seeing kind of like the need that's existing within the city of Boston, kind of similar how we put together our demographic data reports and gather data as to see like what percentage of folks need language access or disability access within the city. I think that would help us when it comes to kind of looking at what is the best method to implement to support this community.
I think Bethany has her hand up.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bethany.
That's okay, no worries. I was just going to note here that at least what we looked into for Vietnamese and Chinese languages in terms of the text to read, or, like the reader accessible technology that's available, it generally is not very available for, at least for Asian languages, just in terms of considering all of this. And I think it is the case that definitely some in the Chinese community, definitely in the Vietnamese community, Khmer speaking, definitely, that there's lower literacy levels.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn has his hand raised. Councillor Flynn.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Edwards. I just wanted to respond quickly to Jennifer. I'm just wondering, maybe would we be able to coordinate with BPDA and do a survey, eventually do a survey of what exactly is needed also in the city in terms of whether through demographics or outreach, but exactly what the demographics are of non-English speaking residents and residents that are in need of interpretation services. Maybe it doesn't apply to this working group, but just down the line, something for the BPDA to consider is what role can they also play in being an advocate and being engaged in this conversation as well.
Thank you. We've also been joined by Councillor Braden. Just to catch up, Councillor Braden, we're discussing several buckets identified by the administration and colleague generally about the language access ordinance. These are not so much as concerns, but just discussion. And we're right now, we're on the adult illiteracy component mentioned in the ordinance. I don't want to put you on the spot if you have any thoughts immediately on it. The next thought will be a combined bucket on text to speech, which we're kind of on right now, and audio. So, Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was late arriving to the party, so I am listening in. I'm very interested in how we accommodate folks with disabilities, especially. And then also neighborhood by neighborhood, each neighborhood has a different makeup. So out here we have Russian speakers and Portuguese speakers and different Chinese. We don't, we have a different mix depending on the neighborhood. So I think to the point raised earlier, really looking at the neighborhood by neighborhood, because each neighborhood has a slightly different demographic and a different makeup. So that's important. I will have to jump off again at 2. So I apologize for popping in and out. Thank you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. It's very important.
Thank you. Councillor Mejia, then I had a quick question.
Yeah, so thank you. Maybe perhaps we can, in part of this process, perhaps maybe have a task force on adult literacy so that we can do a little bit more research and diving in, because it just feels like, nobody really in the city has a clear grasp on when it comes to adult literacy, like how many people cannot read or write, what languages they speak. I don't think that we have a real scope, to Jennifer's point. But I do believe that as we think about, community meetings that I've been to in terms of planning and development, one thing is their interpretation and translation, but there are a lot of people in the neighborhoods that don't even know that there are meetings happening in their neighborhoods that are deciding what it looks like when buildings are coming up, right? So, and then I also just want to really acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of people who have interrupted education, and there are a lot of young people right now sitting in BPS classrooms who are struggling to read and write in whatever native language they speak. And I do believe, and I'm just going to continue to underscore the importance of considering this as a bucket of folks. If we're trying to communicate and engage them and create a space for them to have a voice, then we need to figure out how can we make whatever accommodations we need to ensure that they're being heard and understood and participating in all city processes.
I think a task force seems to make sense because, after I said it about the, red and green, and that's based on my understanding and my cultural understanding of what means go and stop. But it may not be shared by everybody else. So there may be some universal symbols that I am unaware of. But if we're going to be going towards not nonverbal, but if we're going to not use words, or we're going to use symbols, then we might need a task force who does that deep dive in 10 different cultures to figure out what is something that we can all move or agree on to. Just wanted to bring that point up. And I had a question, but I forgot it. I'm sure it'll come back. So moving on to, did you raise your hand again, Councilor Mejia, or we can move on? No? Okay. Jennifer, we were moving on to text to speech and audio. Is that kind of a bucket? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what we were addressing. I do want to take a step back, and I guess when I said doing research, I meant specifically on kind of like the need for text to speech within the city. I don't want to misspeak, because I know there is programs in place within the city that address adult literacy, and that there may be research already that is a part of OWD. So I just wanted to clarify that part there. So I think that kind of text to speech and adult literacy are both together in that kind of conversation that we addressed, along with the audio recordings, kind of seeing what is the need, and then coming together with kind of that research, and then figuring out what is the best next steps for the city to take to address adult literacy even further, or even build upon what is already established within the city and establishing partnerships with many organizations throughout Boston. So I think the next bucket would be, let's see.
I had vital docs.
Yes, vital documents. Thank you. So I'm not sure if everyone has the ordinance up, but there is translation section 6.10.1. I can just read it as well. It says, if a city department is unable to translate a document in accordance with the preceding paragraph due to lack of funding or otherwise, the department shall make arrangements with the Office of Language and Communications Access to contract out the service so that it may be translated. We had brought up the ability to reintegrate some of the original language from the first ordinance, which said, due to funding constraints, the city will be able to use a Babel notice for documents, vital documents that are not able to be translated. I noticed we flagged this as it kind of being left out. We wanted to just flag the importance of being able to reintegrate it, and also flagging that the original language before on the Babel notice was very putting it on the constituents to get things translated. But the new Babel notice that we have within the city focuses on, saying this document is not translated, but here's who you can contact for the department or even our office to get that translated for you. So we just wanted to flag that because I know that it was taken out of this ordinance, and we want to emphasize, during funding constraints, we want to make sure that there's something that is multilingual and available for persons speaking a language other than English to know where they can get this document translated if needed.
So I guess I want to make sure I'm clear. Are you, if the city doesn't, right now it would just basically say, get an RFP. This is the new language, get an RFP to have it translated. And you are asking that RFP process not happen and just revert back to, or you're saying and that RFP process the other Babel.
Yes. So currently, So saying, we understand vital documents have to be translated. One thing that the ordinance before said is, if there's funding constraints within the city and something cannot be translated, that we can attach a Babel, which tells constituents on how they can get, if they need that vital document at that moment translated, how can they get that translated? That was kind of taken out of this ordinance. So it is an and piece. So we would prioritize translating vital documents. However, if there are funding constraints, we want to make sure we can put a Babel notice to direct folks in multilingual languages where they can get that translated, or not they, but where they can go to in the city of Boston to get that translation provided for them.
Okay, Councilor Mejia.
Yeah, so this is another point of okay, how can we get to a good place? I mean, for me, if they're vital but they're not translated, I just don't understand how they are considered vital. And in regards to the contracting component, there is a clear need to provide translation for vital documents. And I think a Babel notice is insignificant because it doesn't satisfy the original need. Think about who these notices are designed to impact. Even if the notice provides resources to get a document translated, it still places the burden of the translation on the community, and I don't think that that's fair. I think that there's a way for us to figure out how we can, assume some of that responsibility, make it easier, hold ourselves accountable to it. I'm just trying to figure out what can be a good way for us to get to this space.
Yeah, and one way that I thought would be a way to approach this is working together with departments to identify those vital documents that are most frequently used by community members. And if a department has many vital documents, maybe prioritizing those that are most frequently interacted with, and then setting a goal within departments every year to work on getting more and more of these vital documents translated, that would allowed by, the funding that we have within the city.
What I understand the language to do is that it's just setting up the city so that if we are going through a recession, we're offering a plan B for sure. But that the goal is, we're not going through that right now. We might have the funding right now. That what I understood from you, Jennifer, was that this was a catch-all. Like if for whatever reason we don't have the money, we are required to do something. But the goal is to have the RFPs go out, possibly to study and identify the top 10 documents used by, I just say the Office of Housing Stability or whatever, and get them done. And then also I think it's not only looking backwards, but I think there should be a firm going forward. Any documents to be produced need to just go ahead and have the 10 languages, 10 language version, at least electronically available, so that they could print them out or whatever.
Exactly. That is what. Oh, sorry, Councilor Mejia. Did you want to add something?
Go ahead, Councilor Mejia.
Okay. Yeah, that was exactly what we're trying to achieve here. So you grasped everything correctly. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Councilor Mejia, if it's only in case of financial concerns that we use the Babel access, but the priority is, and the language requires, that we use the RFP. Is that a balance that works for you?
I don't know. I think I understand, and I do definitely appreciate the financial concerns. Obviously, this is the times that we're concerned with. And we can add back in the Babel notice, but only in the cases of financial concerns, right? I think if we can list it that way, but the language needs to be a little bit more specific. So does that work, Jennifer?
Yeah. And the language, whether it be the same language that was used in the previous ordinance, or I think it said something around like during financial hardships or during funding constraints, that the Babel would be used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, I know vital, I think it would be helpful to also have a better clarity of what we're defining as vital, right? I think that it's important for us to utilize this time to really get clear on what vital is, because vital to me might be all BPDA meetings are vital and all of that got to get translated, and but y'all might think that that's not vital, right? So while we're on this topic, can we just get clear about what is that? And then while we're talking about definitions, can we also get clear on what we're defining as financial constraints in the interest of clarity?
Yeah, I think when it comes to financial constraints, maybe to highlight during the pandemic, right? There were funding had to be prioritized for COVID-19 related information. So that was considered within the city mostly vital. So there may have been vital documents within other programs that were not translated because departments were prioritizing their COVID-19 information specifically for that funding. And then for I don't know if that answers that question, but if so, I can continue to answer the second question around.
Councilor Mejia, you might want to propose a definition of vital, because I know you have a definition suggestion in the ordinance. So if you wanted to, that might help us to work from there and we might just go ahead and adopt, you can do pretty broad, some pretty audacious, wonderful strokes and just go ahead and define it in this language for us, as it's your ordinance. So if we, and I also agree with you, you don't want a flexible understanding of what is a financial constraint. What is constraint to one administration may be different to another. So I also think we might work on what's the floor. Basically, are you saying, as long as we're level funded, you're going to do this? Or if we have a deficit in the budget that year, or we can't, but if we end up close to a deficit, then that might be also the floor. So you might just want to say, as long as the funding exists to keep moving the city forward, we're going to do that. You could look at CPI. So I wonder if it might help if you just came up with your own idea of what is considered restraining that would stop this, and also vital documents or records as well.
Okay.
Oh, you went on mute.
No, it would not be a hearing unless somebody does that. Okay. So I think our office should work on both of these. I think that this is something that we might need to win our second follow-up working session, and would love to get some guidance as well from you, Councilor Edwards, in terms of what would be the best way to kind of define this in ways that make sense. And I love your points about every administration is going to be different, right? So what may be vital to us may be vital differently 10 years from now. So that I love your thinking around kind of some leveling set. So maybe we can work with your office to help us kind of come up with some language that we can bring back to the next working session for both vital documents and also financial constraints.
Absolutely. And I think I remember the question I had initially. I'm going to skip a little bit or pause the buckets real quick. I understand this ordinance, Council Mejia, is formally creating the Office of Language Access. But Jennifer, you're from the Office of Language Access. So what we're just doing is codifying the office. Am I correct, Councilor Mejia?
Yeah.
When we do codify, sometimes there's a whole separate hearing or discussion about that office, because the reason why we do that is we ask the questions, staffing levels, budget levels, necessary mission, all of those different things before it becomes a law, which is not saying that conversation can't happen with this one, but I just wanted to note that that's usually when we create an office in the real way. Sorry, no offense to anybody. It is the back and forth between the city council and the administration, and I just wanted to note that because the definition of the office and the ordinance might be different from how it's operating now.
I'm sorry, was that a question?
No, I'm just noting this, and I guess anyone can respond, but the language, the ordinance creates the office that you're working in right now. And when you have either it codifies exactly what you're doing, right? And okay, great. Or the process of creating an office, Councilor Mejia, is that we can move, manipulate, add, do all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. No.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. I appreciate that. I think what we're doing is we're codifying the language and communications access, which already exists. The scope is relatively the same, but we're more clearly defining their vision and mission statement, and then adding additional layers to that.
So Jennifer, have you read the definition of the office?
Striking a balance, I guess,
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Councilor Mejia. Yeah, we worked really closely with Councilor Mejia and her team on kind of the wording of the ordinance itself. And these are just kind of like the other buckets that we just wanted to discuss, but everything else we worked together.
Yeah, so just the definition of the office that you're in right now, that is in the ordinance, is fine.
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, back to the bucket. Timeline.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to find this section so that I can read it. So if you have it in front of you, it's section 6.10.1, translation 2D, timeline for translation of documents / information. Any information that is deemed necessary to translate into the most commonly used languages shall be released at the same time that the information is released in English. And so we had two concerns as it relates to this part here. And we had proposed before of having language that's said similarly along the lines of the city of Boston will make all best efforts to ensure that the translated information and the English go out at the same time. But our concerns are around the availability of translators. We partner a lot with community-based organizations for translations as well as companies. But there may be some limited availability when it comes to the translators that are available for rapid translation within the city, as well as kind of the capacity internally to move this work. But there are some solutions that we, think kind of change that language to say, the city will make all efforts. We want to make sure that we are setting up language, that is allowing us to. Sorry, I'm blanking out for a minute there. I apologize.
Maybe I can direct the conversation, and then you can respond to some of the things. So, Councilor, if I understand the language as it is right now, it's basically you want simultaneous introduction. That you find that, like, let's just go back to the rent, right? The rental application.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was also small business. Mm-hmm. And, I'm going to leave aside the very likelihood that it's unlikely that we're going to have simultaneous. If there's, like, for example, an emergency, something, get off the streets, do something, there's likely going to be some sort of lag. But okay, so this happens, and we're doing our best. And I do believe that OHS made all best efforts to get as much as possible. I mean, it was the beginning of the day with one, by the end of the day, the rest of the languages, or at least by the next morning. So let's be clear, right? But I think what I could see as a happy medium is when there's a deadline attached, right? When a deadline is attached to a document or to an application or something like that, if English comes out on Monday and 2 days later, the other languages come out, that the deadline would be expanded for those applications that came in that were not English by the 2 days. Does that make sense? We don't want to keep a firm deadline when only one language had the full 10 days and the other ones may have had only 8. So that might be a happy medium. If there's deadlines. Also, Councilor Mejia, within the same day or within 24 hours, just simply saying all languages, the document will be made available for all languages. Those are 2 suggestions I have.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I guess this is probably where I'm going to struggle with this. I'm going to struggle with a lot of stuff, but this one is one of the ones that I'm going to struggle probably with the most, only because what I have seen specifically in the time of COVID. Also, what happened with the exam school conversation, with the advocate, with folks not getting the information out in a timely fashion, there's just been a lot of different examples that I have seen in the city where information has not been shared in a timely, in a culturally competent manner that have left a lot of folks out of certain conversations and out of a lot of information. So I think that this is something that I feel like if it's anything strong enough to, and important enough to put out in English, it should just be as equally as important to make every single effort to ensure that the information is released in multiple languages. And, I'd like to hear what the advocates think about this, but I also think as for the example of getting out the street, I think that is why we added This is why we've added a list of common phrases to the ordinance that we can use or at least consider. It shouldn't just be hello. There should also be, there's an emergency in your area. We plan to plan for an advanced emergency. It shouldn't be reactionary, right? So I think that we just have to really think through about what the implementation of that would look like.
If I could just very quickly, and Natasha, actually go ahead, Natasha, and then I'll come after you.
Okay. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Councilor Edwards is saying. The goal is to make sure that we're setting the city up for success, right? And so if we have to make sure that we're rolling out the languages and appropriate communications in a timely fashion. And so maybe taking a deadline approach, as Councilor Edwards has suggested, as well as, okay, if X is translated, if this is a vital, it comes down to defining as well, right? It's a combination of defining and taking a deadline approach. So if we're able to translate in something in English and we put it out by 9 o'clock in the morning, then there's an expectation, and please don't hold me to this, I'm just throwing out an example, but there's an expectation that the remaining 10 languages would be out by 9 o'clock the next morning. Because to Jennifer's point, we want to make sure that we have enough translators on deck to make sure that it's out. So we don't want to, we want to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success in all things.
Just to add to that point, and I say this not to cause any controversy, but I have been there in the fire at working for the city, and me and Dominique have that very much in common. And in responding to housing crisis or responding to crisis, sometimes you are barely making to get the English version done. You've gone through, trying to respond immediately as soon as possible to get that out there. And it did take, for example, the fire cards. I do take your point, Councilor Mejia, getting ahead. So we did fire cards where they listed all your rights and on a little card that you get. And it took a while for those to even be turned around in an appropriate manner. Now we order them in bulk, or, I'm sure that they order them in bulk so that we don't have to repeat certain things. And I'm sure there's certain documents, certain things that we could just go ahead and have, 10,000 Haitian Creole versions of, the housing search documents, Dominique. I don't know, just 10,000 versions of the Spanish version of housing search, and so on and so forth. Those are certain things that I think that the OL, the Office of Language Access, could almost do an auditing and say, these are documents that people walk in, you hand this document to them almost as part of intake. Okay, get the 10 languages all set. But I think what we're specifically talking about is that emergency moment where no one saw this pandemic. No one saw the millions of dollars coming through. No one saw people literally were going to be in food lines. I mean, no one saw that in 2019. And just to make sure that I think I would feel more comfortable, having worked in the city and respond, that there's a cushion of a certain amount of time where it will be available for sure. Mm-hmm. And I only say that just from the experience, good faith, good effort, putting out fires experience. That's what a lot of city workers are trying to do. And that's why I think No,
I appreciate that. No, I appreciate both Natasha and the explanation, because it does make sense in terms of for a capacity. If we want this to work, we want to set ourselves up for success to begin with, right? So managing those expectations of what that would look like. And then I also think that as part of the process is assessing it, right? Introducing it with some deadlines and seeing whether or not that has made an impact on the level of people being able to access information. Did that shift in any kind of way? I think including that assessment would be helpful in the process. But I would be curious to hear what the advocates have to say, what they've done, and maybe if they have any ideas of how we can, what is manageable. If we were to do a timeline, do we do like 12 hours, 24 hours, and how do we include our community-based organizations as part of our outreach strategy, and include them in this process for communication rollout? Like, are there ways for us to really lean in on the networks that we have across the city to support this work?
I'm happy to turn it over. I know that Yvonne had to leave. I don't know if Bethany or Carolyn are still on. I don't see them. They're probably out putting out fires, doing a lot of advocacy work. But I'm happy to, when we invite them back to further deepen this bucket. And I completely understand. I don't think anyone is disagreeing with you, Councilor Mejia. A sense of urgency is a sense of urgency for everyone.
Yeah.
Can't pay rent. It doesn't matter what language you can't speak, right? So that is not. This is really just trying to strike that perfect balance that sets us up to keep going forward.
Yeah.
Reporting bucket.
Thank you. So the last area that we wanted to touch upon is the annual review and online dashboards. It's really long. I'm not sure if it would be beneficial to read it, but our concern is kind of the capacity of tracking all of this information and the capacity for all city departments to make multilingual dashboards in top 10 languages for all of this information. However, what we do think could be a solution is kind of looking at what LCA already collects and making that centralized dashboard, because we do collect information around the number of accommodations that are provided within the city for folks who use LCA funding, the number of languages that are used for interpretation, the number of documents that are translated, and the number of languages those documents are translated in, and the amount of assistive technology that is provided. So that is something that we are comfortable and kind of producing together and having that data available in those dashboards.
Councilor Mejia?
I mean, everybody knows I'm the dashboard queen. I think that is also, I don't know. I figure we need to kind of like really think through that process. We're calling for information to be collected in a dashboard is something that I think in most of the hearings that we've been in is what we have been looking to do in terms of reporting and accountability. And the reporting is a mechanism in this ordinance. So I'm just curious in terms of Jennifer, if you could just kind of walk us through, it's in the existing ordinance, so I'm just a little bit confused by why this might be an issue.
Oh, yeah. So my concern is around the capacity of every department creating, there's a part here that says these dashboards have to be multilingual into the 5% or 1,000, into the languages spoken by 5% or 1,000 persons. My concern is the capacity for us to produce an online dashboard for every department with all of this information in 11 languages. One thing that does come, the good thing about LCA is with any department that uses funding, all of that data does filter through LCA. So to kind of concise that requirement, we can gather all that data because anyone who uses LCA funding will report to LCA, tell us exactly what they're using that funding for, what accommodation they're providing, how many languages, the amount of funding that's being used. And so we can definitely take that centralized data and create one centralized dashboard that's translated into that language and report that information that we have readily available.
Councilor Mejia?
Can you hear me? Jennifer, I guess what we're trying, I'm okay with doing a centralized dashboard. I'm fine with that.
Okay. That was it for the buckets. I just had a couple more questions, I think, structurally about how we envision this working. My biggest concern is, as a city ordinance, it does and does not necessarily apply to quasi-city agencies. So it doesn't automatically apply to the BPDA. There's other agencies that work within the city of Boston, like Massport. And so making sure that we write something that hooks them in somehow. Maybe we just have to name them directly, Councilor Mejia, or figure out a way to get this in. the reason why they got sued under HUD is because they have federal money.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That was the hook. So just making sure that we write it in a way that there's no confusion.
Yeah. And you know what I really love and appreciate? There was a hearing that you held. I think it was probably one of the earlier ones that we were on until 8:00 at night. I don't know, Councilor Edwards, you were, it was a long one, but I do remember that it was in multiple languages, and it was, I think it was Eversource. It was something. And just the number of people who testified about the language access piece, I think you're dead on in terms of making sure that we're holding everyone who's interfacing with the city of Boston, all things that deal with Boston residents that will impact their quality of life in any kind of way. And I don't know if that's big, if that's a big, bold statement to make, but I do appreciate your idea and thinking around making sure that this is going to encompass everyone who's interfacing with our residents. I think that that's really key, and I do appreciate that.
I think it's vital, mostly because to give folks an example, when Eversource came to East Boston, when they had their EFSB hearing, and then when they came in, they didn't have appropriate interpretation. Mm-hmm. And it was a real slap in the face of folks who showed up. So how much, and that should be part of the conversation. You're going to have to give me a little bit of time to marinate on that, mm-hmm. about the jurisdictional issues and language that could possibly get us in there. We might have to do it zoning or do it under civil rights or some sort of other that this is required that they follow these components. It seems also unfair taxing on city resources to compensate for huge entities that have a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Us put in all of our person power into making sure that their meetings are more accessible, when in reality, But those, I just want to put that out there as a bucket, possibly to discuss. And then also, how does your office currently? This is for Jennifer. And how does your office currently interact with, or push or pull or add into conversations with Boston Police Department and with Boston Public Schools?
So the Boston Public Schools is governed by the school committee. So we don't have, other than sharing of resources and meeting, they have their own language access that they need to follow. With BPD, we are working closely with BPD now, and we have been working with them in the past as well as every department to integrate and make sure that we're all following LCA guidelines and protocols within the city.
Okay, that's interesting for me. Councilor Mejia, were you aware BPS had its own language access standards, and are we in line with them? I thought this would apply to BPS. I guess it does not.
I mean, allegedly, I think that there is a role for us in terms of accountability. Councilor Edwards, to your point, for the city of Boston to have some sort of, role or voice or kind of like say in terms of what those standards look like. They do have their own set, but I do think, Jennifer, as we start thinking about the implementation of this, what role can we play from, an accountability standpoint to ensure that BPS is also adhering to some of these standards, because I don't think those things are usually aligned.
Yeah, and I think it would require kind of bringing the folks from BPS who govern and are in that office to be a part of those conversations as well. But yeah, I think that would be what the next step would be.
Okay. I don't want us to get too far ahead or too, I think it's really important to highlight, talk about one of the greatest interfacers of the city government, generationally and everything. So I'm curious, honestly, what their standards are, and do they have a version of you, Jennifer, in BPS that does their language access, or?
They have an office. I'm not really sure about the standards. I would have to check in and kind of see what they're governed by and so forth.
They actually have a pretty good, robust. They have called the Language of Access, ELLs. I don't remember the right acronyms for it, but I know, having worked with them, I was part of the ELL task force. They have a really robust system. I think they're doing better than we are right now. They have 10 languages that they provide. I think we only do 5. So they might be a little bit ahead of us in that sense. But I think in terms of standards, it'll just be good for us to align ourselves with some key standards across all city agencies.
Okay. I've gone through the buckets that I have listed, and it looks like we have some things to bring back to the next working session, including additional definitions from Councilor Mejia, including we'll pick up and discuss a task force for the adult literacy and how to analyze that. We're also looking at the vital docs. We already discussed that definition, and making sure that we address each one of these buckets and have language to back it up in terms of the next working session. So,
yeah, you know what would be helpful? If we could work with Natasha and her staff too, in helping us with some definition, in terms of what will constrain as vital documents. I think it would be great for us to, I know Dr. Crockett was heavily involved with us in the early stages, but I think I'd love to be able to just do another little powwow with y'all, just so that we can really have a good sense of understanding, if that's fine.
Sure.
Thank you.
Good work. Yeah.
So we'll coordinate our next working session that allows for those interim conversations, so we come back publicly with some, okay, this is great. And thank you so much for everyone for coming and staying the entire time. I think we also do need to invite some more people to come in from BPS, from Office of Workforce Development, who may have some additional data that we didn't have. And thank you so much. And I especially want to thank Kristen McCosh for being here and really understanding ASL is a language, and its access point, and making sure we're built for those who are deaf and hard of hearing is wonderfully inclusive. So I wanted to thank you for being here.
Can I add one final note on that? Thank you, Counselor. Thank you for acknowledging that. And just to illuminate Jennifer's point earlier, when you're talking about translation and things being timely, before COVID, the mayor had a press conference maybe once a month. And then when COVID began and throughout the duration of COVID, press conferences became daily. And then they trickled down to a few times a week. But just the amount of work and time and effort it took to get ASL for those press conferences was a monumental task. So just backing up what Jennifer says, and the mayor, had to get the press conferences out. So we had to do so much scrambling behind the scenes to try to make this happen. It was really a team effort, and we did a good job, but we still didn't get it for every press conference. But and then just one other difference I want to point out between language and access communication is that effective communication is required by the ADA. So ASL is like technically the city's legal responsibility to do. I don't know what the legal responsibilities are for language, but I just wanted to know where that's my lane. I know that we're required to do it, so that's why I pay attention to it. But I just wanted to let people know that in case they weren't aware of it.
No, well, thank you. Without Councilor Bahia, unless you have concluding remarks, we're going to go ahead and end the working session. Schedule a next one coming up, making sure we get down into it, get it done. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.